Welcome, everyone. My name is Mary Warner with the Morrison County Historical Society. You have joined us for the third event in our Exploring History and Culture in Central Minnesota series. This is an annual February event series hosted by 4 Central Minnesota County Historical Societies, the Morrison, Benton, Sherburne, and Stearns County Historical Societies. The series seeks to foster greater understanding and awareness of cultures that have been and continue to be part of Minnesota and its history. This year's programming is presented by the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library out of St. John's University in Collegeville. Today's program is the third of 4 presentations. We have 1 program left on February 26th, so we hope you can join us for that one. In addition to the online Saturday programs from HMML curators, each partner site will have an exhibit of manuscripts from HMML, and we've had a little adjustment. Each site was going to get exhibits for 2 weeks, but Stearns is going to have the exhibit until February 28th, and the Benton County Historical Society and Sherburne History Center will have the exhibit from February 18th, so yesterday, through March 4th. So there are 3 exhibits up right now. Exploring history and culture in Central Minnesota. The Hill Museum and Manuscript Library event series is made possible by the voters of Minnesota through a grant from the Central Minnesota Arts Board, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, otherwise known as a legacy grant. And so we thank the Central Minnesota Arts Board and voters of the state of Minnesota for this grant for the programming. So quick introduction to the Zoom features here. If you move your mouse, you will find a bunch of tools that appear at the very bottom of your screen. There's mute, there's the video button. You can see the list of participants if you click on that. There's a chat feature. So if you have questions, you can put them in the chat and we will have a question and answer session at the end. And then we also have a live transcript tool here. So if you click on that, you will have basically a transcript that shows up at the bottom of your screen. You can also have little emoji reactions if you want to. So I'm going to now turn this over to our co-host for today's program. And this is Mike Brubacher, Executive Director of the Sherburne History Center. Please welcome Mike.
Thanks, Mary. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker. Today's session is the third of the 4 programs. It's titled The Manuscript Heritage of Museum Communities, the Manuscript Heritage of Muslim Communities in Minnesota and Beyond. It's presented by Dr. Josh Mugler. Dr. Mugler is the curator of Islamic manuscripts at the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library. He holds degrees from Oklahoma Baptist University at Shawnee and the Divinity School at Harvard University. And in 2019, he earned his PhD in Theological and Religious Studies from Georgetown University. Today, he will provide an introduction to an important and growing part of the Minnesota community using the visual and textual elements of Islamic manuscript traditions from around the world. The exhibits in conjunction with these 4 programs will be open to the public at the Sherburne History Center through March 4th. Manuscripts and artifacts from the show are also available at the Stearns History Museum through February 28th and the Benton County Historical Society through March 4th. And with all of that, it's my pleasure to turn the time over to Dr. Josh Mugler. Josh, take it away.
Thanks a lot. Thank you for the kind introduction. And it's really an honor to be invited to speak to all of you today. Thanks everyone for coming out virtually. I'm going to share my screen and begin the slideshow. It's really exciting to be able to speak to all of you today. And, with the time that I have, I want to do a few things, which is kind of give a broad introduction to kind of Islamic history and especially Islamic manuscript history, and then kind of transition at the end to talk about Islamic manuscripts in Minnesota and about the kind of manuscript heritage that's here in our own communities here around us. And I have a number of kind of examples on the slides, images of manuscripts, and I tried to use as many from our collection at HMML or from other collections in Minnesota as I could. So these are manuscripts that are right around us for the most part, and several of them are on exhibit at one of the historical societies that were just mentioned. So if you've been to the other two events, then you already know quite a bit about HMML, really, because of Dr. Heinzelman's talk last week. But for those who don't know, we're at St. John's University. We were founded in the 1960s, and the original project was to photograph manuscripts from monasteries starting in Western Europe, starting in Austria, put them on microfilm, and then they continued to work their way around Western Europe and eventually Ethiopia, and do several 100,000 microfilm projects. And then in 2003, the project shifted to begin using digital images, and then also to move into the Middle East for the first time. And that really for a while remained a project focused on Christian collections, churches, monasteries, other libraries around the Middle East that were Christian collections. But then in the early 2010s, they were doing some photography in Jerusalem at a monastery, and got in touch with some of the local Muslim families who also had important manuscript collections. And so at that point, the project began photographing collections that were owned by Muslims for the first time. And so since then, it's been almost 10 years now, or about 10 years now. And in addition to those libraries in Jerusalem, we've done projects in Yemen, and we're working now in South Asia. We're working in Libya and other parts of the Middle East. And then there's been a huge project in Mali with manuscripts from Timbuktu. And so that's actually one of the largest, if not the largest part of our digitized collections now is these hundreds of thousands of manuscripts from Timbuktu. So it's really becoming a rich collection, showing the kind of scholarly traditions of that part of the world, and really valuable in that sense, because with the digital images, we can now put them all online and make them available for people to view for free on our website. So there's lots of material there that people can use for research or for various kinds of study. So just a couple pictures of the location. But then to kind of go into the Islamic manuscript tradition, for those who are not very aware of kind of the Islamic history, basically the history starts in the early 7th century with the Quran, which was recited by the Prophet Muhammad beginning in the year 610 and until his death in 632. And so that's kind of the starting point. There's this message that that comes from God and is kind of put into the heritage of the scriptures that were brought by earlier prophets. So at that time, so he was living in Mecca, which is now in Saudi Arabia. And at that time, kind of most of the power structures of that area were kind of run by the local sort of polytheist religious traditions, but there was really a large amount of influence and growing communities of Jews and Christians, and influence from the major imperial powers like the Roman Empire, which was Christian, and the Ethiopian Empire, which was Christian, and the Iranian Empire, which was Zoroastrian. And so there's all of this kind of influence coming in, and large communities from these religious traditions. And so the Quran really presents itself as kind of in the line of the scriptures that were brought by people like Abraham, like Moses, like Jesus, And so, kind of tells their stories, sometimes reinterprets them, sometimes, gives its own kind of take on, the expectations for this new community in a new time and place. It's revealed in Arabic, in the Arabic language, which none of their scriptures had been. And so it's kind of speaking to a new context. But you can see these images here, and this manuscript is from our collection at St. John's University, and it's actually in one of the exhibits. I'm not sure which county it's in right now, but this is a manuscript of a very popular Arabic prayer book from the 15th century. This copy of it was made probably about the 18th century. The prayer book is written by a Moroccan author, but it really became extremely popular throughout the entire Islamic world. And so you see really different versions of it coming from different cultural and artistic traditions. And in fact, we have in our 2 exhibits that are going around right now, we have 2 different copies of the same text, and they look very different. But you can see this prayer book typically includes a set of pages that are not text, they're not prayers, but they're images of places, sacred places in Mecca and Medina. And so on the right here, you have an image of Mecca. This is the Kaaba, is this sort of black square there in the middle, which is like the most holy place in Islam. And that's where people from all over the world, they pray toward it 5 times a day. And they, if they can, they make a pilgrimage there at some point in their life and do a variety of pilgrimage traditions around that area. But and so that's where kind of the Prophet Muhammad was living and working originally. And then in the year 622, he was having a lot of difficulties with, his followers were being persecuted and this sort of thing in Mecca because he was kind of attacking the current power structures of that region. And in 622, he was asked to come to another city that was roughly in the same region, but a fair distance away, which was called Yathrib at that time. But since then, it has been called Medina or Al-Medina, which just means the city, or sometimes it's called Medina de Nabi, so the city of the prophet. So this became, he was asked to come and kind of take over leadership of the city because they had a lot of disputes and they were having these kind of problems in their society, and they thought that he would be kind of a just and wise outside leader to come in and lead their community. And so he did, and that was kind of the beginning of the first state structure that was really under Islamic leadership. And so that is a very important moment in Islamic history and very foundational. And in fact, it's the beginning date of the Islamic calendar is in that year 622. So that's what all the years are counted from until now. And so this picture on the left side here is the Prophet's Mosque in Medina. And so in this prayer book, you typically have these images that help you kind of think of the sacred places and to keep them in your mind as you pray and to think about all of the sort of sacred history that happened there. So this all happened, within the Prophet's lifetime. He died in 632, but then within a few decades, there were Muslims living and in fact, governing societies from Spain in the West all the way to Central Asia, even a little bit into Pakistan. Over the later centuries, you had many new Muslim communities arising in Southeast Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, South Asia. And so you really end up with this very, very diverse cultural and artistic heritage. And so I'll try to show you kind of examples of manuscript art from different times and places, because there's so much of this rich history and so much of this diversity within the tradition. Very different styles, very different takes on things. So the earliest Islamic manuscripts. Typically, these would not be written on paper. Paper was not a technology that was known in the Middle East in the 7th century. And so they would write it on several different materials. One of them is called parchment, and it's made of animal skins that have been treated so that they're so that you can write on them. Parchment was the main technology for making books in Western Europe well into the late Middle Ages, but in the Middle East, you see it in these very early manuscripts. And this is an image of the so-called Birmingham Quran, which is located in Birmingham, England, and is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, Quran manuscript and Islamic manuscript that's still existing anywhere in the world. And so it's written on parchment. It's written in an early form of Arabic script. And then you also get another writing material, which is papyrus, and this is generally associated with Egypt primarily. This would be made from the fibers of the papyrus plant that grows along the Nile. And so you have these kind of two materials, and typically you would use parchment more for creating books, sort of large scale production of manuscripts. And then the papyrus you typically associate more with kind of short documents, that they're single pages or just a couple pages, a lot of administrative stuff, receipts, and various kinds of legal documents, especially again from Egypt. And so this papyrus here is a legal document that is written in Greek on the top. It's a little bit hard to see. The ink is a little faded, but it's Greek on the top and then Arabic on the bottom. So this is kind of the one of the earliest Islamic papyri, and you can see the transition from Greek, which would have been used under Christian rule in Egypt, and then you start to see the Arabic with Muslims coming in. So you have those kind of two materials. Eventually, as things get a little bit more established, you start to get much more kind of monumental and artistic Quran manuscripts, especially on parchment. And this is an example of that. You can see, obviously, there's some nice decoration in the margin and nice decoration around the beginning of this chapter or surah. But you can also see how big the text is and how, this is an entire page. It only has 5 lines of text on it, and all of the letters are kind of stretched out. So that means that that it's going to take a lot of parchment and a lot of very nice gold ink and red and black and blue ink to produce this entire Quran manuscript, which means that this is coming from a context where things are much more established, and you have powerful and wealthy people who can afford to spend money on the materials and the labor to produce something like this. So this is very different from the Birmingham Quran, which is more of a kind of small scale, just a handwritten thing that doesn't have a whole lot of decoration, although you can see a little bit there. But so this is really once things get more established and you have more of a kind of a wealth and power structure that can produce these things. But then the big revolutionary technology was the introduction of paper, which came from East Asia and was introduced around the 8th century to the Islamic world. So made out of plant fibers, typically from some sort of recycled rags or something like that. But this was much cheaper and easier to produce than parchment. And so it enabled book production on a scale that had never really been possible before. And so you just have, with the combination of the Islamic powers becoming wealthy and stable and established, and then and having money to spend on things like artistic and literary and scholarly production, and then the introduction of this new technology that makes all that much easier, you have this just incredible explosion of thought, of scholarship, of all of these things that, people are writing books basically at a rate that has never been seen anywhere in the world until that time. That there's, in about the year 988, there's a very famous text, which is essentially an index of all the books that the author knows in Arabic. And it's extremely long. It's just, people have already, they've translated so much from Greek, from Syriac, from Sanskrit, from Persian into Arabic, and then they've written so much. And it's just this huge growth of scholarship and knowledge about the world. And so you really have this massive kind of contribution to philosophy and science and astronomy and all these things that starts in this early Islamic period. And this manuscript at the top right here is a very recent manuscript that's in Mosul, but it's actually kind of instructions on how to make paper. So that's why I included it here. It's someone writing in Arabic about kind of how it's all made. So then what would be things that you might see in these manuscripts? Obviously, every book that they're producing is hand written. They don't have a printing press, although they do at some points use woodblock printing in the medieval Islamic world, mostly for things that are kind of meant to be mass produced. So like, little talismans and things, protective prayers that you might, make dozens of and sell them to people, that sort of thing. But for books, it's really going to be all handwritten. So things you might see in them, calligraphy is a huge aspect of the Islamic artistic tradition. And you have it here in the bottom left on a mosque using tiles and paint. But then on the right here, you have it in a manuscript. And this is a Quran manuscript, which is here in our collections at St. John's. So, with the importance of the word of God, the word of scripture, in the Islamic thought, the word really becomes a really important part of the way that art is done as well. And so you just see this incredibly beautiful designs using nothing but letters and words in the Arabic script. So you really see a lot of this kind of art. And this is especially important, and we'll come back to this, but it's especially important because in a religious context, you really, Muslims, like in general, will kind of avoid any sorts of images of animals and that sort of thing, or people, because you want to really focus on God alone, and there's no images of God, and so you use words instead as your primary art form. And then also geometric decorations. These are some examples, again, from a mosque on the left and on the right, and then from a manuscript that we have and this manuscript is also a Quran. It's from West Africa, and it's in our collections at St. John's, and it's in one of the exhibits that we have going around. So again, if you get a chance to check those out, please do. And I'm not sure exactly which county this one is in right now, but it's out there. And then vegetation becomes really popular in artistic designs. So you have all of these kind of at the beginning of a text. You have what's called a headpiece on the right here. So it's just kind of over the top of the text. And it's just incredibly beautiful designs using flowers and colors, all sorts of kind of vines going everywhere. And then similar on the left here, using the vegetation really wrapping around the whole page, and then also the beautiful calligraphy and the gold ink there. So these are very popular artistic styles as well. In addition to those just kind of decorative elements, you might have manuscripts that include diagrams for scientific purposes. You have on the right here, there's an astronomical information, showing the orbits of different planets and that sort of thing. On the left, it's more of a geometry. So it's actually a text about inheritance law, but it's specifically talking about how to measure out parcels of land so that you can divide them up correctly among the different children and other relatives of someone who dies. So very important in any agricultural society, certainly in many parts of the United States. This has been sort of a very important aspect of what happens when someone dies and you have to divide it up. They have so many kids and all this. So you get these kind of diagrams as well. And as I said, there's so much scientific and other knowledge being produced. So there's really all sorts of things that you might read about, that you might see depicted in this way. And then back to the question about animals and humans, it really depends. Sometimes people can be a little reductive and they say Islamic art doesn't have people in it, doesn't have animals. That is not true as a blanket statement. It is true in some contexts. So like I said, it's a very diverse artistic tradition or set of traditions. And so some contexts really love, these depictions of these sorts of creatures, humans, animals. You have angels here on the left. And then other traditions don't really use them as much. And it also depends on the type of book. So like I said, in a really, what you might call a very religious specific context, you're going to see none of this really. So like you would never see this in a Quran manuscript really from anywhere, with very few exceptions. Most kind of legal and theological texts won't really have these kinds of decoration, but all sorts of literary and just poetry and scientific texts that are describing the creatures of the world, that sort of thing. You can easily find these, and you see them much more in kind of Persian and Turkish speaking context, which includes really the majority of the Islamic world, all the way from Southeast Europe to Southeast Asia, much less so in the Arabic tradition, kind of speaking generally. So just kind of like different preferences, different styles. And it does include at times even, depictions of prophets in these stories that they sometimes appear. So it really is kind of a broad range of types of things that you might find. And this one in the center here is a manuscript that we have here at St. John's, and it's actually it's a little bit of a trick, because you can kind of tell if you look at it that the text is written there, but the picture doesn't really fit it very well. You can see it kind of like spilling over on top of the text and covering up some of the text, and that's because this manuscript is actually something that was fairly common, I think, especially maybe in South Asia, in the kind of colonial and modern period, where people realized that European, colonists would pay lots of money for these kind of paintings on manuscripts, and so they just started to kind of like find scraps of old manuscripts and just paint things over them. So like this painting was done several centuries probably after the text on the manuscript was actually written, and that's why it doesn't really fit it very well. But it's a good kind of like souvenir that a tourist might buy. And I've even seen in an antique shop down the street from me in Minneapolis, I saw something very similar to this, although higher quality. But so like, it's a good way to create something that, is kind of a good souvenir that people are interested in. So anyway, like I said, many diverse styles, and I just want to kind of run through many of them here. This is a North African manuscript, a prayer book. Really cool, just choices of colors, just incredible range of colors, and this design that looks like a candle here made out of text, mostly Arabic text. This is South Asian probably. And you see that kind of like vegetation all around the outside. Then this is like probably a late medieval Egyptian or Syrian kind of Middle Eastern style. Again, using the nice calligraphy at the top with the title, but then just kind of having the gold design. And often you would have kind of in this rosette shape at the bottom, you would have like the name of the patron or someone that you were copying the manuscript for, whoever gave the funds to make it possible. This is more of like an Ottoman Empire kind of Turkish style, and you see kind of the vegetation on the headpiece there again. This is West African, and like I said, we have a huge amount of West African manuscripts digitized that are still in Mali. We also have a small number here on site at St. John's. Yeah, this is a West African style. And then this is a Yemeni manuscript. So again, kind of a nice decorated title page, lots of notes all over the place here. This is Southeast Asian, and you can see it's got the Quranic text in Arabic, and then smaller written between the lines is a translation into, I'm not sure, Javanese maybe, or yeah, I think maybe it's Javanese or possibly Malay. And then, and then here on the left side, you've got this East African manuscript here. This is probably from Ethiopia, Eastern Ethiopia. But really you can see just a very different color palette, but doing some really interesting stuff with the borders and the kind of the use of the empty space, the white space for the text, I think is really cool, where it's, you're not actually like writing the text, you're writing the outline of it. So yeah, just a huge kind of variety in the manuscripts. And then many of them don't have a lot of that artistic decoration at all. They focus on just copying a text, on any subject you can think of. And so this is an example of that. This is another East African, probably Ethiopian manuscript, mostly just plain text. But you can see, there's a lot of notes added all over the margins and between the lines. But they always, with almost no exceptions, Islamic texts will start off by invoking the name of God, in the name of God, compassionate and merciful. And then they'll have some sort of praise for God, which often kind of suggests some of the themes that they're going to talk about in the text, praise be to God, and then they'll talk about whatever relationship to the text. And then they'll have prayers and blessings on the Prophet Muhammad. And then they'll transition to kind of introducing, okay, what am I going to talk about in this text? Often they'll state their name, the author's name, and just kind of talk about whatever their topics will be. And this is actually a book of law, so it covers kind of wide-ranging legal topics. And again, kind of the marginal notes here. And then at the very end of the manuscript, you'll have what's called a colophon. This is typically where the scribe, the person who wrote the manuscript, who copied the manuscript, will give their name many times. This one was copied by someone named Jamet bin Abdurrahman, Jamet, son of Abdurrahman, son of Ali, son of Gabriel. And he was from Harar, which is in Eastern Ethiopia, and is kind of the main center of Islamic scholarship in that region. And he copied this in the year 1243, which is 1827 on our calendar. So they'll tell you, in this case, he tells you not only the year, but the month, the number day of the month, the day of the week, Thursday, and even the time of day. So he copied it and finished it around noon on a Thursday in 1827. So you get a lot of really helpful information, and sometimes from the scribes, which is very helpful in our study of these. And then, of course, there's additional information kind of all over these manuscripts, because these were the main place that people could write things down. You know, if you have kind of access to these books, then there's, you know, blank space on title pages, blank space on flyleaves. You can write all sorts of things down. So you get notes from people who owned the manuscript, which, you know, is something that people are still doing today, writing their name and, you know, the date or something when they owned it. You get on this manuscript on the right, there's a note about from the guy who repaired the manuscript. It had been pretty badly deteriorated over the centuries, and in 1891 he kind of assembled it back together and wrote his note here. You get things like this on the left, where this is a manuscript from 1685, but then on the left here, kind of turned sideways, you have a note, and this note is in Turkish actually, but it's from 1796, and it's someone noting the birth of a son named Suleiman. So you have people who will write kind of family history, you know, like you might have in an old family Bible or something like that, where people will just kind of like keep notes of when their children were born and that sort of thing, or died, you know, when people died, as well as, you know, notes about scholarly information, you know, history and things like that. So really all sorts of valuable information. And this stuff is really cool in the manuscripts, because this is not anything that you're going to see usually in a printed, you know, when someone comes and makes a printed edition of one of these texts, they're just going to leave all this additional information aside, but it can have really interesting information that's helpful for understanding kind of like the history of everyday people in these regions. So then a little bit about Christian manuscripts from the same context. And I just want to briefly allude to this, because if you want to really know more about this, then you have to come back next week for David Calabro's presentation. But there were really large and prolific Christian communities in these regions as well. And so you get lots of Christian manuscripts alongside the Islamic ones. And that's what, you know, the history of HMML, you know, we started in the Middle East with Christian communities. Now we've done some with Muslim communities as well. But it's really interesting to see, you know, there's a similar kind of headpiece situation here on the left. It's more geometric. But this is also in Arabic. You have other manuscripts in languages like Syriac and Coptic. But then they have, you know, unique characteristics, like obviously the decorative cross, which is not something you would see in an Islamic manuscript. But, you know, they're using some of the same styles. Yeah, and then finally, this is not a tradition that is, you know, 600 or 700 years old. This is something that really continued well into the modern period. The printing press did not become dominant in the Middle East until about the 19th century, even into the 20th. And so you really continue to have a very, very rich culture of manuscript production well into the 19th century, if not the 20th. And so this is the Colophon of a manuscript from 1932, which is now in Jerusalem. Yeah, I mean, you know, there were still thriving, you know, groups of scribes and people writing texts, and it was very manuscript dominated well into the modern period. So this continued to be a very important part of that world. Now, looking more specifically at the United States and eventually into Minnesota, I want to talk about some of the earliest Muslims who were here. And the earliest Muslims in the United States generally were enslaved. They were brought here from West Africa, so some of those same regions that were now doing photography, like Mali, as well as more of the coastal regions to the south and the west. People were brought here as slaves, and generally they were expected to leave any sort of Islamic religious practice behind, there were, they were generally more or less forcefully converted to Christianity. And so, there's very few examples of people from that context who were able to kind of openly practice the Islamic traditions that they were that they had once been connected to in West Africa, and especially because people were illiterate and they were cut off from their kind of social context that had made that had been part of the religious tradition. It was very rare for them to have any ongoing connection to that, at least openly. But there were exceptions, such as this man, Omar bin Said, who came from probably what's now Senegal, ended up enslaved in South Carolina and in North Carolina in the early 19th century. And he was actually from an elite kind of context in that region. And so he knew Arabic very well. He wrote in Arabic. He kind of impressed, white Americans enough with his knowledge of Arabic that they started asking him to write all sorts of things. And so a lot of his legacy today is actually manuscripts, because he would write down things like his autobiography. And so here on the right, you see the English title page of the autobiography that he wrote in 1831, when he was still enslaved until he died during the Civil War. But then, he wrote the autobiography in West African Arabic. So you get the page on the left here from it. And he would also write passages from the Quran. There are even examples where people asked him to write, because he had officially, and again, kind of openly, he was expected to be a Christian, and he had become a Christian in early in his enslavement, but he would still, there's a lot of questions about kind of like what was going on in the interior, because he was continuing to kind of write in ways that that reflect a deep love for the Quran and the Islamic tradition. And there are even examples where someone asked him to write like the Lord's Prayer or Psalm 23 or something in Arabic, just because they wanted to see it. And he said, sure. And so he wrote like a passage from the Quran, and he was like, yeah, here it is. And so they have it, you'll see like the English label on it says this is Psalm 23, and it's actually just like a Quran surah, something like that. So there's a lot of indications that he still felt connected to that Islamic tradition, even if he wasn't allowed to really openly express that. But he was one of the most famous early American Muslims. So, because this is so rare, and because, obviously Minnesota is in the north, it was a free state, but there were people enslaved in Minnesota. There were mostly around like Fort Snelling, where people would come from other parts of the country, and they would bring their slaves with them. Most famously, Dred Scott and his wife were married at Fort Snelling, and then eventually went back south to Missouri. And I'm originally from the St. Louis area, so it's a really interesting kind of connection between where I grew up and where I live now, that Dred Scott was living up here. He married Harriet here, and then ended up back in St. Louis, and that's where the Supreme Court case got started, that eventually declared that he was to remain enslaved. So we really have no evidence of any of these people being openly connected to the Islamic tradition, but again, there are many reasons for that, and it's hard to really say much without more information. But when we really start to know more about Muslims coming to Minnesota is when immigration begins from the Ottoman Empire around the 1880s. And so, just like people coming from Northern Europe, from Germany and Scandinavia that came to this region and began farming, you have a lot of the same sort of thing happening on a smaller scale, but still happening from the Middle East. And this included a lot of Arabic-speaking Christians, especially, but also some Muslims. And actually some of the first mosques in the entire country are out in rural North Dakota. There's one that was set up just for the local farmers. And then the kind of oldest existing one that's still in use today is in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. So you get, this region is where a lot of these first Muslim settlers were really coming. And then of course you have the various movements that began to preach Islam to Black Americans in the 20th century. And especially kind of the Nation of Islam and that sort of thing. And so this photo is the oldest mosque in Minnesota, as far as I know, which was started as a Nation of Islam mosque for Black Minnesotans in the 1950s. And it's here in North Minneapolis. So you get kind of another growing community. You have the immigrants coming in, you have the conversion of Black Americans. And then of course, starting in the 1990s, we start to get very large waves of refugees and other immigrants from Somalia and other parts of East Africa who are largely Muslims. And so at this point, I think that the population of Muslims in Minnesota is about 1% or so. But they're, of course, a very noticeable part of life in Minneapolis. Very prominent people in politics. And of course, we have the very first Muslim congressman was Keith Ellison, who's from Minnesota. Now we have Ilhan Omar, but they're again kind of from different backgrounds. Keith Ellison from that Black American movement, and then Ilhan Omar from the Somali community. So, various kinds of backgrounds and just kind of a diverse community. But really, Minnesota has become, at least on the national politics level, one of the most significant places for Muslim Americans, which is kind of cool. So then I want to wrap up here by talking about what Islamic manuscripts I know of in Minnesota and how they got here. So there's a few different contexts. We have the Minneapolis Institute of Art has a nice collection of a few dozen manuscripts, mostly fragments, so just like single leaves that are nicely decorated. So you've got this really cool Quran on the right. You've got this scientific text in the middle, where I'm not sure exactly what's happening, but probably doesn't end well for these birds. Then you've got this history on the left, which is, it's actually a depiction of Moses and the Pharaoh from the book of Exodus and from the Quran. But so Moses is on the right and he has turned his staff into a snake, although the snake really looks like a dragon in this depiction, which is a very cool kind of take on the story and shows some East Asian influence. And then you have, of course, Pharaoh is there with the crown at the bottom left, and he's kind of cowering at this enormous serpent in his court. These are some of the manuscripts from the Minneapolis Institute of Art. And again, they're mostly just single pages. And they were, and the exception to this is a complete manuscript of a literary book called the Baharistan, or the Spring Garden, from the 15th century, written in Persian. And so this is another very, very nicely decorated manuscript. And they, on their website, they quote the beginning of this text, which says that birds won't reach their destination if they don't start their journey with praising God. So you can see how there's still, like, even in this literary context, they're still starting with this praise to God, even though it's a little bit more kind of poetic sounding than it maybe is in some other contexts. But so basically their entire collection was all donated by one person at one time. And her name was Margaret McMillan Weber. She died in 1951. She was the daughter of a very prominent real estate family in Minneapolis. And she, who owned land in Minneapolis and in southern Minnesota, they were farming, and so they became very wealthy that way. And she actually married the grandson of John Deere, and so continued to be very wealthy. But so, you know, it was one of these very elite families where they kind of, like her older sister painted portraits of wealthy Minnesotans, and her brother collected European art, and she was the Asian art collector. And so they kind of had all their bases covered artistically. But when she died, so she had a collection of both East Asian and kind of Persian influenced Islamic art. And when she died, she left it to the Mia. And so that's really where more or less their entire collection comes from. They haven't added much since then. And they have, of course, they have very rich collections in East Asian art, but this is kind of the heart of their Islamic material, at least in terms of manuscripts. And then there are some manuscripts at some university libraries. This one is at the University of Minnesota. Again, mostly just kind of fragments. I know McAllister College also has some, just fragments that were collected by scholars. The University of Minnesota also has a large South Asian library, and I believe they have some manuscripts in Persian and Urdu and Arabic probably, but it's really not a lot of huge collections of manuscripts. And then of course there's HMML. And as I mentioned before, the main focus of our work is to photograph manuscripts around the world and not take them, because there's been a long history of Europeans and Americans kind of taking a lot of cultural heritage from all over the world and putting it in Paris or London or the Vatican or whatever, or Princeton. And kind of the main project of HMML has been to make these things available through digital photography, and not have to take them from the people who own them. But we do have a very small collection of materials here on site that were donated to us at various times. About 40, I would say, Islamic manuscripts in the collection. And they were donated by a few different people. One of our field directors in the 1970s acquired some. In the Middle East. We had a huge collection of materials donated in 1995 by Frank Kazmarczyk, who was an artist and collected a lot of book history and book art. And that was mostly European, but he did collect 7 or 8 kind of fragments of Islamic manuscripts that were mostly kind of beautifully decorated, you know, kind of inspirations for his own art in terms of calligraphy and that sort of thing. We had a few manuscripts that were donated by Paul Hense in 2011, who was from Southwest Minnesota, and so was acquainted with the work of people in the state, and then worked for the CIA around the world, and mostly in Ethiopia, so he acquired some stuff there. But yeah, he was one of these kind of classic Cold Warrior type people who was really involved in like getting the U.S. government to sponsor like Muslim extremists to help fight the Soviet Union and that sort of thing. But then like collected and donated these things to HMML. And then we have some that were donated just last year by a man who had been in the Peace Corps in Ethiopia. So a small collection, but that's kind of just from various sources. And then there's of course private collections. And when I say this, I'm mostly thinking of people who brought manuscripts with them as kind of heritage items when they came to this country. Especially the Somali American community in Minnesota. And I really want to shout out the research that a former intern of mine is doing right now. His name's Mohammed, and he's a grad student at the University of Minnesota. But he is doing some great research on just figuring out like kind of what people have here and how they use them. Sometimes they're just heirlooms that are stashed away in the attic in a box. Other times they're very kind of prominently displayed. Sometimes they have a role as a kind of symbol of authority. They show that your ancestors were from a prominent enough family that they were literate, that they were scholarly, and so you can kind of show that you have this kind of pedigree, and this kind of role in the community by having these manuscripts around that go back centuries. And so there's a variety of kind of ways that people might interact with this heritage, but in terms of Islamic manuscripts in Minnesota, you really have these kind of diverse strands where some are like wealthy Minnesotans collecting things, putting them in museums, putting them in universities. Others are just kind of like family heirlooms and that sort of thing. So I'm going to wrap it up here. It's almost 11:30, but I'm happy to stick around and answer any questions you might have. And again, just thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you, Dr. Mugler. This was a wonderful presentation, super, super interesting. I have all kinds of notes of questions and that kind of thing. What I'm going to do is do our sort of end of program wrap up, and then we will stay for questions after as we did the last 2 weeks. So I want to thank you, Dr. Mugler, once again for your presentation, and I want to thank HMML for bringing all the programming and our exhibits to central Minnesota area here, to all of our partner organizations, the Benton, Sherburne, and Stearns and Morrison County Historical Societies. Once again, I'm going to thank the Central Minnesota Arts Board for the funding for this programming. And I thank all of the attendees for coming and exploring history and culture in central Minnesota through HMML. There's one more event to remind you, and that is next Saturday. It will be on Coptic manuscripts. We will be having an email with a survey to follow up. And please do remember to visit the exhibits, and there are 3 of them at the Benton, Stearns, and Sherburne County Historical Societies. So once again, thank you. So those of you who need to leave can go ahead, but we will now jump into questions. And we have one, it looks like from Mike at the Sherburne History Center, and actually kind of had the same question. So Mike asks, who were the authors of these manuscripts? Was there a high literacy rate so that anyone could produce these books and manuscripts? Or might this be the work of a few scholars? And I was really wondering about the literacy rate, because so much of the imagery is words. And so how would people understand the Quran if they couldn't read?
Right. Yeah. Well, that's a great set of questions. I mean, yeah, the literacy rate, of course, would not be nearly as high in general as it is today. So, the texts that are being written, I mean, there's kind of two strands here. People writing texts, originally, authorship, and then manuscript production as well, copies of texts. But both of those are going to require some education. So there's a lot of work that goes into learning how to write well. How to write, and then of course the artistic, if you want to do some of this really elaborate artistic stuff, then you need to learn the artistic skills as well. So it's very much not something that's open to everyone. It is the work of the educated class. Now that might be more people than you might think. There were really, I mean, like I said, there was just this explosion of scholarship. And so there were huge scholarly networks reaching all the way across the Islamic world. And, any city would have a large, number of scholars that you could study with. And so, it wasn't entirely exclusive, but it was certainly something that would be limited to people of a certain class for the most part. and generally that's that's who was producing all of these texts. So just like in other traditions, Western Europe and other places, most of what we have left behind is things that were written by wealthy and educated elites. But there are a few exceptions to that, and really that was a large, it was at times a very large group of people who were able to access that kind of education. Part of the problem is that Arabic is spoken in, still today and going back many centuries, Arabic is spoken in a number of different dialects, but there's kind of a standard scholarly dialect that people would write in, the literary language. It's like if you learned how to write like Shakespeare, basically, or like some other kind of famous English author. And so you not only have to just know the language, but you have to know how to write it in a scholarly way. And then one last point is about how would people understand the Quran, which is another great question. And most, the vast majority of people would access it orally and they would memorize it. I mean, not everyone would memorize it, but many people would. And you would hear it recited. And so you would access the text that way. So even if you couldn't read it, you would be very familiar with it. And so in that case, the calligraphy might be in many cases more decorative than like meant to convey textual meaning, because I mean, in many cases, calligraphy is just so elaborate that it's hard to read any of it. And so, it can be kind of more of a visual art, and people know the text from hearing it more than from reading it. At least for the masses of people who are less likely to be literate.
Okay, thank you. That was a great answer. Just super interesting. I see here that Tim Turnus from Himmel has said, Dr. Mugler mentioned that many of the earliest mosques in America were built in the upper Midwest. According to the Atlas Obscura, the oldest still existing mosque in the US was built in rural North Dakota in 1929. And then there's a link. Let's see. Anne Marie says that the survey is new, so please do take the survey. Oh, yep, we do a new survey for each one. She said, we'd like feedback from each event and it will not block you this time. Thanks. Okay. Matt Heinzelman, Dr. Heinzelman from Himmel. Are there any reasons that Arabic would be harder to print with movable type, the way European languages are printed? Do Arabic characters change depending on their location in the word?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Matt. It's a cursive script, so all, with a few exceptions, all the letters are connected within a word, and so the letter will look differently depending whether it's at the beginning or the middle or the end of a word, and so yeah, that does make it very complicated and to use movable type, because the letters don't generally appear separate and independently the way that letters in Latin script do. So that makes it difficult. And so in a lot of the early printed books in Arabic script, you can see the signs of that, because between each letter, there's like a tiny little gap where they just didn't have the precision to make it all like perfectly cohere in the movable type. And so there's a real kind of look to very early Arabic printing, which does not really look good from the perspective of someone who's used to this beautiful calligraphy, that when you're used to seeing this, where everything is nicely connected here, and then you have suddenly little kind of gaps between the letters, it doesn't really look very good. And so that's part of the reason why people were hesitant to adopt printing.
Okay, thank you. So I appreciated that you mentioned something about basically the artistic cross-pollination. You showed us the manuscript that had the cross. And are you seeing more of that as you digitize at Himmel? Are you seeing more sort of direct cross-pollination between different manuscript artists as your collection grows?
Yeah, I mean, you definitely see very similar styles, across the traditions. We have almost no Jewish material, but we have a lot of Christian and a lot of Islamic material in our collections. And you really, I mean, as you're looking at things that are from the same time period in the same region, there's a lot of overlap. But the Christian manuscript production does have its own kind of traditions and its own styles that are a little bit different depending on what exactly you're looking at. But then there are also examples where you have just direct, people directly working kind of across traditions, where you have like I've cataloged one manuscript that's a commentary on the Psalms in Arabic, entirely Christian text, but was produced in Cairo in a workshop that probably was producing Islamic text as well. And so, the entire thing is like 100% Islamic in style. It's got the same kind of flower headpiece, and it's dated by the Islamic calendar, not the Christian calendar. And so there's like, there are definitely examples where people were just kind of working across traditions, where you have Christian scribes copying from Muslim patrons or vice versa. Like it's a variety of stuff. So yeah, I mean, there's just so much diversity and so much of this kind of interaction across the traditions.
Yeah, it's something I think we see today, but don't think about it happening in other parts of the world at other times, So just super interesting. It just dawned on me as you were talking about it.
Yeah, but I mean, from before Islam was a concept, they were interacting with Christians and Jews in Mecca and Medina and around Arabia and beyond. And so, there's no way to kind of pick them out individually. They all kind of created themselves in dialogue with each other and really exchanged so much, so many ideas and artistic styles and things like that over the centuries.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions here. Do you have any final thoughts you want to share, Dr. Mugler?
Nothing, I think, just happy to have this opportunity and really appreciate the invitation.
We're happy to have you. This was really a fascinating talk. And folks, we do hope you will join us next week. Thanks, everyone, and have a great weekend.
Okay, thanks, everybody.